Okay, so at Trusting News, we work to help journalists understand distrust in news and also help them rebuild relationships between themselves and the public that they serve. My name is Lynn Walsh. I'm the Assistant Director at Trusting News. And today we're going to talk about how you can rebuild trust between yourself and your community by creating what we call a reporter mission statement. Before we dive in, though, I want to go over just some quick kind of the landscape of where trust stands in the US. There's been lots of research, lots of data done on this topic, and we have different slideshows going over some of that you can review. But the basics, just so you know, and you probably already know, trust in the media has been declining for decades. It hit its lowest point in 2016. Since then, it's rebounded a little bit, but still has actually come back down from some of that rebound that it took. Some things that we know about trust and someone's likelihood to trust in news. Levels of trust differ depending on who the individual is. So we know that younger people tend to distrust in media more than older people. We also know that someone's political affiliation, specifically here in the US, can greatly impact their likelihood of trusting in news and in the media. So we know that Democrats tend to trust in news more, and we know that Republicans tend to trust in news less. And the other thing that's important to point out is we know that the type of media you're talking about and a person's likelihood to trust it also matters. People tend to trust local news more than national news. The other really important thing that relates to this topic specifically is that most people have never talked to a journalist. And so when we think about building trust and building a relationship, most of the time, the people we trust are people we have relationships with. We've probably talked to at least, whether that's online or in person. We've known for years, right? And so if most people haven't spoken to a journalist, then it's really maybe not that surprising that they don't automatically trust us. And so reporter mission statements are a tool to kind of help make that connection with people to rebuild trust. A couple other data points related to some surveys and some research that has been pointed out. We as journalists, and probably yourself, if you're a responsible, ethical journalist, you would say that you really care about the people in your community, and that's why you do this job. You want to help make that community better. Well, unfortunately, not everyone sees it that way. Non-journalists don't necessarily see it that way. This is a survey from Pew from 2019, and it found that 46% of people think journalists rarely care about people like them. And then this part, which I think really for me as a journalist is something that I find shocking because we don't do this. 33% of people surveyed said they don't think journalists provide fair and accurate information to the public. And I think all of you would look at those and think, wait a second, I do care about the people in my community and people that I'm writing for and writing about. And also I work really hard to provide fair and accurate information to them. Another data point to share, this comes from a recent poll done by Knight and Gallup, and they basically asked people how much they agree or disagree with the following statement. And that statement was, in general, most local news organizations do not intend to mislead, misinform, or persuade the public. And you can see here that people do think that journalists do tend to mislead, misinform, or persuade the public. And if you're not doing that, then we want to make sure that we are telling people that you're not doing that. And so why does it matter? Well, again, if this is something that is not part of your values and you're thinking of those statements and that data, and you're like, wait a second, I actually do the opposite. I'm working really hard for the good of the community. Well, we want to tell them that. But more importantly, this matters because if people don't trust us, they aren't going to consume our content. If they're not consuming our content, where are they going to go for information? Will those spaces they go to be reliable? Is the content going to be accurate? Is it going to be ethical and responsible content? Or is it going to be one-sided? Is it going to be pushing an agenda? if people are going to places that are producing information that contains misinformation, contains inaccuracies, is not ethical or is not produced responsibly, and they use that to then make decisions about their daily lives, whether it's at the grocery store or it's when they go vote, what does that mean for us and our society? And so this whole scenario here, this why this matters, this is why I do this work and why I think this work is so important to rebuild trust. And this is also what we have been doing at Trusting News since 2016. So we work directly with newsrooms, with researchers, and we constantly are trying to find out how can journalists rebuild trust with the public. And so throughout that time, we have learned a couple things that we know journalists can do. Primarily, this work falls into a couple categories. The first being transparency. We know that when journalists are transparent about where content comes from, what their values are, how they do their jobs, that is something that can rebuild trust. That transparency and clarity can help build trust. We also know that there is a very big need and want from the public for this engagement. The more you talk to your community, the more you respond to your community and listen to them, you can produce content that better serves them and is relatable to them, useful for them. So transparency and engagement are two areas that we work with journalists a lot in order to rebuild trust. Now, when you're talking about how to be transparent and you're talking about engagement, a lot of this work involves a lot of humility. We have to meet news consumers where they are. We have to be willing to sometimes take their criticism, which may not be said in a way that is a question. It might be yelling at you in all caps in the comment section. And unfortunately, sometimes that anger and frustration comes from the frustrating experience that is consuming information. And so we should have some humility in that. And we also should be willing to talk about how we can be better. If we made a mistake, let's correct it. Let's talk about it. Let's use it as an opportunity to make the content better instead of trying to hide that mistake or act like it didn't happen. The other thing that is part of this is articulating a counter narrative. And also when you articulate that counter narrative, taking advantage of attention where you have it, not hiding it on some page that no one's ever going to find. And so today, when we're talking about creating reporter mission statements, that builds into this idea of articulating a counter narrative. And so why this is important and why that counter narrative is so important is that you have to remember when people don't know how journalism works, they are not going to give you the benefit of the doubt. And actually, they're going to probably make an assumption, and almost always that assumption is negative. So the idea with a counter narrative is to get out ahead of time to explain, fill that information void with facts, with your mission, with your goals, so they don't have an opportunity to think, why are they covering this story? Why did they talk to that source? Why do they always cover this high school football team? Is it because their kids go there? Well, no, you're clarifying it kind of ahead of time. And so some misassumptions that our newsroom partners often hear, and maybe you have heard yourself, and these are these misassumptions, again, that when people don't know something about how journalism works, they're not going to give you the benefit of the doubt. Instead, they're going to make an assumption. And generally, as you'll see, these assumptions are negative. And some of those include that you pay sources or that your sources pay you to run a story. You are actively suppressing information that you don't agree with, or you choose stories and cover stories that validate your own opinions or the opinions of those in your newsroom or your ownership group. Money, corporate ownership, donors, advertisers, influences news decisions. When you have an advertisement from a local hospital, they assume then that is potentially influencing your news coverage over anything related to healthcare. These last couple ones, I know definitely I have heard working in TV news, you sensationalize stories to get clicks, ratings, money. Sometimes you may look at this and be like, wow, yeah, some of our headlines, that's definitely true. Well, we can work to be better. The other thing here is that you just are out to catch people looking dumb. You just want to catch people doing something wrong and then highlight it, share the story. And for a lot of us, that's not the case, right? We are not trying to do those things. But unfortunately, we do have to highlight when something goes wrong or when someone does something wrong sometimes. But let's explain how we do that, why we do that. Some other misassumptions that people might be thinking is that journalists don't understand me. Again, going back to the fact that most people haven't ever spoken to a journalist. They may not think that no one on staff is like me. They don't feel represented by the people inside the newsroom. Or when they see stories that might be about them as an individual or the group of people they may represent, whether it's a generation like millennials, Gen Z, or it's an ethnicity, a gender, any kind of grouping of people, conservatives, people who are religious, they may see stories of people in groups that they are part of, and they don't think you get it right. They constantly see stories and think, no, that's not how I am. They may think that you're just trying to stir up trouble. And kind of this idea that we create stories that say that all people, all millennials, all conservatives, all Hispanics are the same. You already have your mind made up about me. And when they see that, that leads to that distrust. They don't trust the content because that assumption that you're making in that story isn't correct. And so one way to combat this is to, one, talk about your values, your goals, but also talk about who's on your staff. Explain who's writing these stories. And that's where reporter mission statements come in. And that's where earning trust by telling the story of your journalism, you as a journalist, can help. And so when we talk about telling your own story, we want to have you talk about why people should invest in you, feel a connection to you, trust your team. So the individual journalist, yes, your team collectively, but also who are each of those people that are reporting on the stories, producing the stories, editing the stories. And the bottom line here is you may be thinking, well, why do I need to do this? Well, if you don't do it, no one else is going to. We need to tell our own story so people can see who we are, can see us as real people, and can see what our goals are in the coverage that we're talking about. Now, when I talked about on a couple slides ago about how this is needed and you want to grab attention when you have it, at Trusting News, we talk about putting transparency elements, putting elements about your mission in two different places. We talk about it as institutionally and then as day-to-day. The institutional stuff are things that might live on an about page. Maybe they live in a staff bio page, right? Those are great. Those are things that are good to have because you can point people to them regularly. If people have questions on social media, maybe someone calls you up, you can send them to that page. But what's really key is to share that information day to day when you have their attention. So when someone's reading a story, they should be able to find out who's writing the story and what are their goals with writing the story. And so that's what a reporter mission statement can do. And so you may be thinking, okay, what does a reporter mission statement looks like? Well, a couple of examples for you. This comes from KPCC in LAist. This is Mary Plummer covering politics. And this is actually a mission statement that they would use on the bottom of their stories. So they actually put these at the bottom of their stories about these topics. And she covers politics. And so this is what she says. Democracy can be messy. In Southern California, the political system is changing in front of us, from how we vote to who is running for office. Many voices are shouting to be heard. I examine who gets listened to and why, and provide a guide to anyone who wants to more fully participate in civic life. So you can see how this is a little different than staff bios, which I'm going to talk about and kind of give a difference to compare the two. This gets a little more into the details and it meets people where they are about the topic. And here's another example from the Coloradoan. And this is again about democracy. And they talk about how he explains how democracy matters. Nothing matters more to him than helping people understand the world they live in and making sure the government is accountable to the people it serves. And so then the Coloradoan did something a little different. They took these statements about democracy and then attached them to a call for support to continue to support the journalism and this type of reporting. So those are two examples. So what do reporter mission statements do and what should they include? Well, Reporter mission statements are a good way to hold you accountable by getting on the record. These can be a great way, once you write them and you have 5 different story ideas in front of you, to look at the story ideas and think, which ones really fit with what I said my mission was? So it can be a really good way to help you make decisions and kind of keep you on the path of what you said you're trying to achieve. It also can be something that others will hold you accountable for. They also show that you have values, you have ethics, you have goals. You're not just randomly covering things. There's a plan here. You're trying to achieve something. It helps you keep the coverage consistent and tied to those goals. And then most importantly, it can help guide the community on why to contact you and how to contact you. And so if you look back at the example from Mary, she talks specifically about she's providing a guide to anyone who wants to more fully participate in civic life. So she gets really specific to what she is trying to cover. And so what should a good mission statement include? Well, it should definitely include the why, the reason you do what you do, the how, the way you conduct your work. And so again, going back, are these through stories? Are you meeting people? Are you creating events? Are you trying to bring people to events to get feedback? And then the what, the actual thing that you do. So you want to talk about the reason you do what you do, the way you conduct your work, and then the actual thing that you do. And so the difference between a staff bio and a mission statement, you can see that kind of at first glance, okay, they're kind of similar. You have a staff bio, it's about the journalist, mission statement, also about the journalist. Both are focusing on journalist expertise. Now, where it kind of gets a little different here is a staff bio generally is going to talk about awards, past experience, past work of the journalist. And this is where a mission statement is looking more into the future and what the journalist is doing, not necessarily what they have done. So where the mission statement, while the staff bio would talk about past experience, in the mission statement, you're going to talk about what the journalist hopes to achieve with the reporting. What are the goals of the reporting? Why are they covering this beat? Who are they hoping to talk to? What types of stories do they want to cover? Staff bios tend not to change that often. You might update it if there's a new award, maybe some update to an experience, versus mission statements could change often depending on how your coverage goals change, right? Maybe as you're covering education, you're focusing primarily on K through 12. But then all of a sudden there's a shift in the newsroom and now you want to focus more on the college education system. So you could see how you'd want to change that in your mission statement. The other difference is staff bios tend to be a little bit longer versus mission statements. The goal here is to write it in 2 to 3 sentences, and then ideally share these in day-to-day coverage, share them on social, which I'll talk about in a little bit where else these can go. Staff bios do include personal details about the journalist's life. Mission statements can too, but again, the focus should be more on the reporting beat and the coverage goals. You kind of want to think of this, the staff bio is you get to find information about the journalist. The mission statement, you learn a little bit about the journalist, but you're really learning more about their goals, and it's more focused, and the language is written in a way that's better serving for the community. It's great if both can include a photo, and it's great if both can include contact information. And so let's look at a couple more. Here's an example, again, from KPCC and LAist, and this is about a business and economy reporter, David Wagner. And so you get the first sentence, it says, the Southern California economy is strong. So why are so many people living paycheck to paycheck? I tell the stories of these people, their struggles, and the many creative ways they make a living. I share information on strategies that can put people on path to greater prosperity. And then there's an actual ask for an engagement. Have questions you want to answer? Ask them below. So this is a great way to say, contact me if you have ideas. One way that this, could be improved is saying, if you're doing something creatively to make a living, tell me. I want to know. I want to know what you're doing. And this is another example from LAist covering higher education. He says, I focus on the stories of students trying to overcome academic and other challenges to stay in college with the goal of creating a path to a better life. So he covers higher education, but that's a very specific lane within that beat. He's focusing on stories of students specifically trying to overcome challenges. So if you're thinking, I can do this, we hope you are, because we really would love to see more journalists create a mission statement and share it regularly. Here's how you can start. Grab a piece of paper, grab your phone, get a note out. Maybe do an audio note if you want, and answer these questions. What types of stories do you cover? What is the goal of your coverage? What are you hoping to achieve with these stories? And what types of issues should people contact you about? And then the why do you focus on these types of stories? I would highly recommend kind of writing it and just kind of freely throwing ideas. If it's bulleted, it doesn't have to be in formal sentences. Maybe go for a walk, do something that energizes you or gets you thinking about this. Write it down, come back to it. Maybe you write it down again and come back to it. Then once you have it and you're like, okay, I think this has everything that I want to convey, then decide, okay, how can I take these thoughts, these bullets, these kind of different things that I've been thinking about and put them into 2 or 3 sentences. So then actually write it as you kind of saw with those examples. Then I'd highly recommend having someone else in the newsroom read it, maybe having a non-journalist read it, someone from the community, and say, what do you think this means to you? And then maybe based on their feedback, you make a couple changes. Maybe you don't. And then it's ready to go. And the idea is then you share it, you make it public. That's the whole idea here. Now, these reporter mission statements can go alongside a staff bio or a bio page, or where your staff bio already exists. We've seen a newsroom do that, but they do so well being shared on social media, especially if you have an image with it or you can produce it in a way that is visually appealing. They work really, really well embedded into the stories themselves. You can actually put it at the bottom of a story. Put your bio with a call to action. Have people contact you if they have the story to tell related to your beat. They also can go at the top of the story. When you're sharing it on social media, you could add it as a thread. But the idea is that this works really, really well, getting it in front of people where they are and when they're consuming your news. And so we know this work takes time. We know it takes an investment. But the whole idea here is if we want to build trust, we need to tell people who we are. We need to talk about our goals. This is one way to do it. And remember, if mistrust is often about these misassumptions, having that counter narrative is so important. And so you need to tell your own story. And because if you don't, who will? No one else is going to. And so we hope you will take this to take all that we've kind of talked through right here to create that reporter mission statement and share it widely with the public.